The Palace Medical Wing at 300 smells like every hospital I have ever worked in, and I have worked in more than I can count. There is something underneath the antiseptic, underneath whatever the Vethol use in place of antiseptic, which is a faintly violet aerosol that smells like cold river water. That is just the smell of sickness, of bodies working hard to stay alive. I have breathed it since I was 22 years old, first in field tents on contested moons, later in trauma bays on 3 different space stations, later still in a small clinic on a resettlement block on the edge of Terran-controlled space where the pay was low and the need was very high. Now I breathe it as a janitor, pushing a mop through the long, pale corridors of the Vethol Imperial Palace Medical Wing on the night shift, and I have decided that this particular smell is the most honest thing in the universe. It does not care who you are. Emperors bleed the same way farmers bleed. Sick children smell the same in a palace as they do in a refugee tent. The Vethol do not know this about me. They know that I am Vas Karen, human female, night floor contractor, here on a 3-year labor permit that the Terran Resettlement Authority negotiated as part of a broader services agreement. They know that I am 61 years old and that I have a hip that aches in cold corridors, and that I take my midshift meal alone in the service alcove at the east end of the wing, because the Vethol kitchen staff are polite, but do not quite know what to do with a human woman who does not eat their food. They know I do good work. The floors of the medical wing are cleaner on my nights than on any other shift. I have been told this by the facility's supervisor, a Vethol man named Orvesh who has the coloring of old pewter and the communication style of a maintenance log. He said it once. He has not said it again because he does not feel the need to, and I respect that. They do not know that I spent 31 years as a combat medic in the Terran 3rd Expeditionary Corps. They do not know that I have cleared more airways than I have mopped floors, though the gap is closing. They do not know that I can read a patient's color and posture, and the quality of their stillness from 15 meters away and know within a margin of seconds whether they are in trouble and what kind of trouble it is. They do not know, and I have not told them because nobody asked, and it is not my job. My job is the floors. I came to this work the long way. After the Expeditionary Corps, I spent 4 years at the resettlement clinic on the Vethol border worlds, a chain of moons that the Terran Resettlement Authority had designated as transitional settlement zones, which in practice means crowded, underfunded, and in constant need of people who could do 10 jobs at once. I did 12 jobs at once. I triaged. I diagnosed. I did minor surgery with tools that had been repaired so many times the original manufacturer would not have recognized them. I delivered children in conditions I would not describe to someone who had eaten recently. I sat with people who were dying and could not be saved, and I made sure they were not alone when they went, which is the most a person can do in some circumstances, and which is, I have come to believe, not a small thing. When the clinic closed, a funding decision made by people who had never visited it, I was 57, and I was tired in the specific way that a person gets tired when they have given their whole life to a thing, and the thing has ended. I took the janitor's post at the Vethol Imperial Palace Medical Wing because it was work, and because it paid, and because I speak the Vethol court dialect well enough to function, and because I am not built for retirement, which I understand some people love. I do not love it. I need a building around me and a task in front of me, and the smell of the place where sick people go to get better or at least to have company while they do not, even if the task is floors. Even if I am invisible while I do it. Invisible has never bothered me. In 31 years in the field, you learn that the most effective person in many situations is the one nobody is paying attention to, because the people nobody is paying attention to have both hands free. I was doing my job at 300 on the night. The Emperor's youngest son nearly died. I will say this carefully because I am not interested in making myself into something I am not. I was mopping the corridor outside the East Sick Room. That is the truth of where I was and what I was doing. The East sick room is the largest in the medical wing, 3 times the size of the standard rooms, with walls of pale crystal gray stone that the Vethal use in all their important spaces, and a door of dense weave alloy that is mostly opaque, but has a narrow band of transparent composite running vertically at roughly eye level, which I assume is there so staff can check a patient's status without triggering the door seal. I had passed that door a dozen times on earlier nights without giving it more than a glance. On those nights the room was empty, its lights at standby dim, its monitoring equipment in sleep mode. On this night the lights were at full, and there were 7 Vethal physicians standing inside the room around a central bed, and the monitoring equipment was producing a soft continuous sound that I can only describe as the Vethal equivalent of an alert tone. Not an alarm, not yet, but the sound a system makes when it is watching something very carefully. I slowed down, I did not stop. A janitor who stops and stares through the window of a sick room being attended by 7 physicians is a janitor who is going to be told to move along, and I did not want to be told to move along before I had seen what I needed to see. So I kept my mop moving and I looked through the transparent band as I passed, the way I have learned to look at things in hospitals. Not obviously, not with the head turned, but with the eyes moving while the body stays on its task. It is the same discipline I used in field situations where you needed to assess a casualty without alerting whoever had put them in that condition. The body keeps doing its job. The eyes do a different job. After a while it becomes one motion. The child in the bed was small. Vethal children are slightly larger than Terran children at equivalent developmental stages, but this one looked young. I put him at 5 or 6 standard years, which is on the younger end of what I have seen the palace staff refer to as the imperial family's current generation of heirs. He was lying very still, not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of a body that has directed all its available resources inward and has nothing left for the surface. His coloring was wrong. Vethal have a natural skin tone that runs from pale blue-gray to a kind of luminous blue-white depending on their health and their lineage. The royal family skews to the luminous end, and this child was not luminous. He was the color of old chalk. There was a faint bluish cast to his lips and to the small visible triangle of his throat, which I could see because the neck of his sleeping garment had been pulled slightly open, presumably by the physicians examining him. I noted all of this in the time it took me to push my mop 6 feet down the corridor. I kept walking. I rounded the corner to the supply alcove, put my mop in the bucket, and stood for a moment with my hands on the handle. A child with that coloring, that stillness, that cast around the mouth and throat, with 7 physicians present and none of them doing the one thing that coloring called for, was a child with something wrong in the airway. Not infection wrong, not pressure wrong, obstruction wrong. The kind of wrong that a blood panel and a neural scan and a cellular chemistry analysis will not find, because it is not in the blood or the nerves or the cells. It is in the throat. It is something the child swallowed or inhaled that is sitting in a place that is not quite blocking the airway completely, but is reducing the airway enough that the body is slowly losing the fight. And every hour the physicians spend looking for a systemic cause is an hour the obstruction sits there doing its work. I thought about this for approximately 30 seconds. Then I thought about what I was. I was a janitor. A human janitor on a work permit in a wing of an alien imperial palace. The 7 physicians in that room had credentials I could not read and training I did not understand and diagnostic equipment worth more than I would earn in the remaining years of my life. It was extremely possible that I was wrong. I had been wrong before, in 31 years of medicine, and being wrong in a sick room with a patient in front of you is a thing you live with. I have been wrong about a diagnosis in the field and watched someone pay for that with something they could not get back, and I have carried that, and I will carry it the rest of my life. Being wrong is not a clean outcome, but neither is staying in the corridor. Being wrong in the Emperor of the Vethal Dominion's youngest son's sick room, as a foreign contract janitor without credentials or authorization, was a thing of a different order entirely. It was the kind of wrong that ends a work permit. That ends a residency. That ends, in all likelihood, any future Terran presence in this wing, because the Vethal are a formal people, and their sense of violation when their boundaries are overstepped runs deep. I understood all of this. I have worked in enough foreign systems to understand when I am operating inside someone else's order, and what it costs to step outside it. I thought about that for another 15 seconds. Then I went to find someone to talk to. The corridor outside the East Sick Room had two people in it. A young Vethal aide in the pale gray uniform of the medical wing support staff, who was standing by the door with a data slate and the expression of someone who has been standing by a door for a very long time and is not sure what to do with their hands, and an older Vethal physician I had not seen before, who was pacing in a small controlled way near the far wall. I approached the aide, because the aide was younger, and because junior staff in medical settings are usually the ones who are actually paying attention to what is happening and frightened enough to listen. I said, in the Vethal court dialect that I had spent 6 months learning before I took this post, that I was sorry to interrupt, and that I had noticed the child in the East Sick Room from the corridor, and that I had a question about his presentation. The aide looked at me. She had the wide, pale eyes that the Vethal used to convey a range of emotions, and right now they conveyed that she was looking at a human janitor who had just said something unexpected. I told her what I had seen, the coloring, the stillness, the cast around the mouth and throat. I said it quietly and precisely, the way I had been trained to relay a field observation, without opinion, without diagnosis, only what I had seen with my eyes. In the field you learn to say what you saw, not what you concluded, because the person you are reporting to often has more information than you and the combination of your observation, and their knowledge is what produces the right answer. I was not the treating physician. I was an observer. I reported what I had observed. The aide looked at her data slate. She looked at me. She was trying to decide something, and I could see her trying to decide it, and I waited. She was a young woman who was standing outside a sick room where the emperor's son was fighting for his life, and 7 physicians were inside not finding the answer, and she had a human janitor in front of her saying something that might be relevant and might be nothing. She made a choice. She went to the older physician and repeated what I had said. I watched the physician's face. He was a senior man. I could tell this from the layering of his robe, which in Vethal medical culture indicates rank in a way I had taken some time to decode. And he had the expression that senior physicians in every culture I have ever worked in adopt when a non-physician tells them something about a patient. It is an expression that is not quite contempt and not quite patience. It is the expression of someone managing an interruption while holding a great deal of other things in their head. I have worn that expression myself. I understood it. I was also aware that it was, in this particular moment, a problem. He looked at me across the corridor. He said, in a voice that was perfectly civil, that the child had been under continuous monitoring and cellular analysis for 11 hours, and that every available diagnostic modality had been applied, and that the physicians were pursuing a systemic cause through standard differential protocol. He said that the corridor was needed clear. He thanked me for my concern. He said it without malice. He meant it as a fact about the situation, not as an attack on me specifically, and I understood that. And I also understood that he was wrong, and that the difference between those two things, his civility and his wrongness, was a child breathing. I said with equal civility that I understood and that I would return to my work, and I went back to my mop. I pushed the mop to the far end of the corridor and back. I cleaned the junction with the supply alcove, the area near the room entry tracks, the long stretch of floor between the sick room and the ward station. I worked at a steady pace and I kept my breathing even. This is a discipline I developed in field situations where the thing you want to do, the urgent physical thing, is not the thing the moment requires, and what the moment requires is steadiness. Steadiness is a skill. It is not the same as calm. Calm is the absence of urgency. Steadiness is carrying the urgency without letting it drive the body before the body should move. I have been steady in worse situations than a corridor outside a sick room where I had been told to stay in my lane. While I worked, I ran the assessment again, the way I had been trained to revisit a field observation when you had time to do so without the pressure of immediate action. I went back over what I had seen through the door glass and checked it against the differential possibilities. Infection would present differently, the color changes, but it changes across the whole visible skin surface in a Vethal patient, not concentrating around the secondary airway structures. Cardiac pressure would affect the chest movement in a specific way that is not consistent with what I had seen. A neurological event of the kind that produces sudden unconsciousness does not leave a patient in that particular compensating respiratory pattern. The pattern I had seen was not a body that had collapsed. It was a body that was working hard, working against something specific. Every time I came back to that, I came back to obstruction. I am aware that I am not infallible. But I have mopped this corridor for 2 years, and I have been a medic for 31. And the combination of those two facts means I have learned to trust the second one when the second one is speaking clearly. I worked my way toward the east sick room again, in the normal pattern of my shift. When I reached the door the second time, the monitoring sound had changed. It was not a subtle change. The Vethal equivalent of an alert tone has a series of registers, and the register it was in now was not the one it had been in 20 minutes earlier. This one had a cadence to it, a regular interval pulse that I recognized across species lines because elevated distress monitoring sounds the same in every medical system I have ever worked in. The body reaching a threshold, the body sending up a signal. I have heard that particular cadence in field tents and trauma bays and on transport ships and twice in vehicle wreckage where I was trying to keep someone alive until an extraction unit arrived. And every time I hear it, my nervous system does the same thing. It comes to full attention, not panic, attention. The aide was already inside the door. The senior physician was already inside the door. All 7 physicians were clustered around the bed, and at least 2 of them were operating handheld diagnostic tools, and one of them was speaking rapidly into a communications device. And there was, in the room, the particular quality of coordinated panic that medical professionals produce when they are competent people confronting a situation they do not understand and are not resolving. I know that quality. I have produced it myself on occasions when I was the competent person who did not understand. It is not a failure of the people. It is a failure of the framework of the diagnostic map they are working from, which is right for most situations and wrong for this one. I pushed the door. The door resisted. It has a weight to it, the dense weave alloy that is not immediately yielding, and then it opened and I went in. The senior physician turned toward me. His expression had moved past civil management of an interruption into something sharper. He said my name. He had apparently learned it from the aide, and he said that this room was restricted and that I was to leave immediately. I was already at the bed. The child was lying on his back. Vethal medical beds have a slightly different geometry from Terran ones. The head end is elevated at about 15 degrees, and the surface has a mild conforming quality that distributes the body's weight, and the child's position on it was the position of a body that has been placed carefully but has not moved since being placed. His chest was moving. That was the first thing I confirmed. Small, shallow, rapid movements, not the deep, regular breathing of sleep, not the labored heaving of severe respiratory distress, but the quick, shallow pattern of a body working harder than it should have to for every breath, a body compensating. When a body compensates for a partial obstruction, it does not advertise it. The breathing is fast enough that to the untrained eye it looks like anxious breathing, or elevated heart rate, or any of a dozen systemic conditions that a blood panel would investigate. The tells are in the quality of the chest movement, in the color around the mouth and the secondary structures of the throat, in the very slight extension of the neck that the body produces when it is trying to open the airway by geometry. I have been trained to see those tells. I saw them. His mouth was very slightly open. The bluish cast around it was more pronounced in the full light of the room than it had been through the door glass. I looked at the child for approximately 4 seconds. Then I said to the room, with the flat clarity that I had been taught to use when announcing a critical finding in a field setting, the voice that is not loud but is constructed to carry over noise and over the social pressure of a crowded space, that the child had a partial airway obstruction, and I needed someone to hold his left side and someone to be ready with suction. No one moved for a moment that was about 1 second long and felt longer. Then the aide moved. She came around the far side of the bed and placed her hands on the child's left arm as she had understood my instruction, which told me she had some training beyond administrative support, and this was enough because I was not going to wait for more. I rolled the child onto his side, gently, with the care I had learned with small bodies over 31 years, with the particular tenderness you develop when you understand how fragile the mechanics of a child's frame are, and how easily tenderness and efficiency can coexist when you have practiced them long enough. His weight was slight in my hands. He made no sound, which meant he was deeply under but not so far that his body had stopped its compensating work. I could feel the rapid, shallow movement of his chest against my forearm as I held him. I gave him 2 firm, precise back blows between the shoulder blades with the heel of my hand, not hard enough to injure, hard enough to mean something. In human children, this technique is well established. In Vethal children, I was working from the anatomy I had studied before I took this post. I spent 3 months reading Vethal pediatric physiology, because if you are going to work in a medical wing of any kind, you read the physiology. And what I knew was that the Vethal thoracic architecture is close enough to human that the principles transfer, with adjustment for slightly different skeletal density and slightly wider rib spacing. The child coughed. It was a weak cough, the cough of a child who has been unconscious and whose muscles are not fully responding, but it was a cough, and it moved air, and the something that was in the airway shifted. I could hear it shift. It is a very particular sound, a cough that has a different quality at the end than the ones before it, a quality that means the thing that was seated has moved. I have heard that sound more times than I can count, and it is not a sound you forget. I have dreamed about that sound, on the difficult nights, because some of the times I heard it were times where it was the only thing that stood between a person and a very bad outcome. I adjusted my position and gave 2 chest thrusts, modified from the standard, slightly less force than I would use on an adult, angled for the geometry of a child's thoracic frame and accounting for what I estimated of this child's development stage and weight. And then something happened that has happened in every successful airway clearance I have ever performed in 31 years. A small definitive event. The body announcing in its specific way that the obstruction has cleared. A release. A change in the resistance of the chest under my hands. And then the sound, not from the monitoring equipment, but from the child, a different quality of breathing, a real breath, the body taking what it had been waiting to take. And a small object left the child's mouth and landed on the pale crystal gray surface of the medical bed. I looked at it. It was a hex-locking pin, workshop fastener, approximately 12 millimeters long hexagonal cross-section, made of some Vethal alloy that I did not recognize and could not name. The kind of thing that comes off a piece of equipment being assembled or repaired. The kind of thing that ends up in unexpected places when you are a child who is curious about the world and puts things in your mouth to understand them, which is a universal behavior across species, because small creatures are small creatures, and the universe does not vary as much as we think it does in the ways that matter most. Children touch things. Children put things in their mouths. Children swallow small, interesting pieces of the world around them when they are in the process of learning what that world is made of, No one is to blame for this. It is simply what small creatures do. It was, in the room at that moment, the quietest object I have ever seen. 12 millimeters of Vethol alloy on a pale medical surface. 7 physicians and 1 aide and a human janitor all looking at it. And from the child, a real breath. Deep, pulling air through a cleared space, the kind of breath that the body takes when it has been waiting to take it. His chest expanded in a way it had not been expanding, and I watched the color at his lips, and at that small triangle of his throat, and I watched it change. The blue-white of the Vethol healthy child slowly asserting itself through the old chalk gray. The way color comes back into a face when a body begins to believe it is safe again. He did not wake up immediately. He would need time for that. The body does not simply bounce back from 11 hours of inadequate oxygenation. But his breathing was real now and regular, and the monitor tone had changed back to the careful watching register, down from the elevated distress register, and in the world of hospital tones, that is the equivalent of a door opening into a room where the air is good. I know that tone change in my bones. I have stood in more rooms waiting for it than I can count. I straightened up. My hip reminded me, as it does, that 61 is not 41, and that bending over a child's medical bed is not the same as bending over a clean floor. I noted this and set it aside. I looked at the hex-locking pin on the bed and then at the aide, who was still holding the child's arm and looking at me with an expression I have seen before. An expression that is not quite awe and not quite disbelief, but the specific face of someone who has just watched something they did not know was possible by someone they did not expect to be capable of it. I looked at the senior physician. He was looking at the hex-locking pin. He was a senior physician, and he was very good at not showing things on his face, and he was, right now, not entirely successful at it. I understood this completely. I have been in his position. I have been the physician who built the wrong framework around a presentation and followed it down a long corridor while the actual answer was somewhere else. It is not a comfortable place to stand. You stand in the wreckage of 11 hours of correct procedure applied to the wrong question, and you look at the small object that the correct procedure could not find, and you find a place to put what you are feeling so that you can go on and be useful to the patient who still needs you. I said gently, because he was a good physician, and he had simply not known what to look for because his diagnostic framework did not include obstruction as a primary cause in this presentation. The child's fever had developed as a secondary response to the prolonged partial hypoxia, which would have made systemic causes look plausible, and which had sent every available diagnostic tool down that path. That the pin had likely been swallowed sometime in the previous 12 to 18 hours and had been sitting in a position that allowed limited air exchange. Enough to keep the child alive, not enough to keep him well. And not visible on any internal imaging that was looking at tissue and chemical and cellular pathology, rather than looking for a foreign object, because the object had been seated in a position that placed it outside the primary scan planes for the protocols his team had been running. He said nothing. His eyes moved from the pin to the child and back. I picked up the pin with the corner of my work cloth. I did not have gloves, which is a thing I noted with the part of my brain that was still running a standard post-procedure review. And I set it on the side table where his team could retrieve it for whatever analysis they needed to perform. Then I picked up my mop handle, which I had leaned against the wall when I came in, and I said that I would let them get on with their work and that I would finish the corridor. The senior physician said my name again. I stopped. He said, and I will give him credit for saying this because it cost him something, the same way it costs any good physician something to acknowledge the limits of their framework, that he had dismissed my assessment in the corridor and that doing so had extended the child's danger by at least 20 minutes, possibly more, and that he owed me an acknowledgement of that fact. He said it looking at me directly, not at the floor, not at the pin. He said it the way a person says something they mean. I said that I appreciated it, I meant it. He asked me how I had known. I told him what I had seen from the corridor, and I told him the basic logic of what that presentation means, what that particular combination of color and stillness and secondary throat signs indicates, and why it points to obstruction rather than systemic cause. I told him that I had learned it in a context where imaging equipment was often not available, and where the surface presentation was the only information you were going to get, so you learned to read it very carefully. I told him that his team's protocols were right for the vast majority of presentations they would encounter, and that this was a rare exception. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what my previous profession had been. I told him that it had been a long time ago and that I was a janitor now, and I went back to the corridor. I did not know that the Emperor had been in the room. I understood this later, that he had been there since the third hour of the crisis, in an alcove to the left of the main bed cluster that is partially screened by a partition of the same pale crystal gray stone as the walls, that he had been standing there the entire time the physicians worked, that he had seen everything from the moment I pushed through the door to the moment I walked back out of it. I did not know this at the time because I was focused on the child and then on the physician and then on my mop, and because the Vethal imperial family in a non-ceremonial setting moves quietly and does not announce itself, and because I am a janitor and I do not look for emperors in corners. The emperor of the Vethal dominion, standing alone in the screened alcove of his son's sick room at 300, watching 7 physicians fail to find an answer for 11 hours. That is not a thing I would have thought to look for. I should have. Perhaps I have simply spent enough years being invisible myself that I do not always think to look for who else might be invisible in a room. I was 7 meters down the corridor, pushing the mop, when I heard the door open behind me. I turned. I had seen the Emperor twice before, at a distance, at events where the medical wing's cleaning staff were present in the background of a formal occasion, and where the correct behavior was to make yourself as much a part of the architecture as possible. He is a tall man. The Vethal royals tend to the tall end of their species range, with the luminous blue-white coloring of the lineage at its fullest expression, pale silver-white hair worn in the layered formal arrangement that indicates his rank to anyone who knows the code, and a face that I am not equipped to read completely because the Vethal carry a great deal in the micro-expressions of the ridge above the eye and in the angle of the high cheekbones, and I have not learned to read all of it. What I can read in a Vethal face is distress and its absence, effort and its relaxation, and what I saw in his face as he stood in the corridor doorway was a man who had been holding something very tightly for 11 hours and had just felt it begin, very slowly, to come loose. He was alone. I do not know where his security was. I suspect that in a medical wing in the middle of the night, in a room where his son had been fighting for his life for 11 hours, the security had been instructed to give him what space could be given, because some things are too large for other people to stand alongside you for. He looked at me for a moment. I stood with my mop and looked back at him and waited, because this is a thing you learn to do, to wait in the presence of someone who has something to say and needs a moment to find it, not to fill the silence, not to offer it a word that would make it smaller, just to hold it open, the way a door held open in a corridor invites a person to walk through when they are ready. He said, in a voice that was level and quiet, and had the quality of a voice that has been doing hard work for many hours and is now, carefully, standing down, that he had a question. I said that he was welcome to ask it. He said, "Who cleared my son's airway?" It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as a man saying aloud a thing he already knew the answer to, in the specific way that people say things they already know when what they are really doing is marking the moment, making it official, stating it into the air of the corridor so that it exists as a fact in a place where it can be witnessed, even if the only witness is themselves and a human janitor at 300 in a palace corridor. I have heard people make statements this way before, at the end of difficult things. When the crisis has passed, and the body begins to understand that it is over. I said that I had. He looked at me for another moment. He said, "You are the janitor for this wing." I said that I was. He said, and I will remember the exact phrasing because he said it very carefully, with the deliberate placement that the Vethal use when they intend a thing to be permanent, not conversational, that his house owed me a debt of a kind that his house did not often incur. I considered this. I said that I was glad the boy was breathing and that I did not need a debt. I said it with respect, because he was the emperor and I was not going to be rude about a gift that was genuinely meant. But I said it clearly. In my experience, accepting debts from powerful people complicates one's life in ways that a woman of 61 with a good work permit and a room with an east-facing window does not need. He was quiet for a moment. He asked me why I had come through the door after the physician sent me away. I thought about this for a moment because it is a real question and it deserved a real answer. It is easy to say that I did it because I knew something was wrong and I could not let it stand. That is true, but it is not the complete truth. I told him that I had been in enough rooms where the official answer was wrong, and the non-official answer was right, that I had learned, eventually, that the deciding factor was not the title of the person holding the answer. That titles are useful things. They represent real expertise, real training, real investment. But that titles are built for the general case, and the general case is not always the case in front of you. I told him that I did not enjoy overriding physicians in their own rooms, and that I had some understanding of why the physician had responded the way he had, and that I was not making a statement about the quality of his team, who had been working hard on a problem that their diagnostic framework was not equipped to see. I told him that I had gone through the door because the child's color was wrong and the sound of the monitor was changing, and at that point the cost of being wrong and going in was lower than the cost of being wrong and staying out. That when those costs invert, the choice is already made, and the only question is whether you are honest enough with yourself to act on it. He listened to all of this without moving. He said, "You have done this before." I said that I had done it many times in a different life. He asked what that life had been. I said that I had been a field medic with the Terran military for 31 years. He was quiet again, and in the quiet I heard from inside the East sick room, the soft change in the monitor tone that means stable, means holding, means this child is going to wake up tomorrow and ask for something to eat and probably have no memory of the last 12 hours, which is a mercy that the very young are sometimes granted, that the gap in their experience simply closes over like water closing over a place where a stone was dropped. The emperor heard it too. I watched his face when he heard it. I will not describe what I saw in full because it was private. The way the particular quality of a parent's relief is always private, something they carry in their own body, and that belongs to them and to no one else. I will say only that I turned away and looked at the corridor and gave him the moment, the way you give people moments when you are a janitor and you are very experienced at not being in the way. When I looked back, he had composed himself in the way his kind composes themselves, a very slight adjustment of the spine, a resettlement of the hands, the face finding its formal register again. But the eyes still carried the private thing, and that is the part of a Vethal face that takes a little longer to reassemble. He said that he wished to offer me a formal recognition, a place in the palace's official record as someone who had rendered service of the first order to the imperial house, a stipend, an elevation of my residency status that would allow me to remain on Vethal territory for as long as I wished without the permit cycle. I thanked him. I meant it. The residency piece in particular was worth something real to me, because the permit cycle is a wearying thing, and I am 61, and I do not have the energy I once had for bureaucracy, and the prospect of not having to renew every 3 years through the Terran resettlement authorities' forms and interviews and processing delays was something I felt with the part of me that is just tired. I said that the residency, if it was genuinely on offer, would be a thing I would accept with gratitude. He inclined his head. Among the Vethal, that is an acknowledgement that registers formally. I have been here long enough to know that. It is not a small gesture. It is the gesture that closes an agreement. I said that the stipend and the record and the elevation of title were not necessary, and that I would rather they were not made. He looked at me with the expression that people look at you with when you decline something they expected you to want. It is an expression that crosses species, I find, the particular stillness of someone recalibrating. I told him why. I told him that my name in the palace's official record meant questions from the facility's supervisor, and from the Terran Resettlement Authority, and from my colleagues on the cleaning staff, and from anyone who had an interest in the official record and a curiosity about why a human janitor appeared in it under a recognition citation. I told him that I had spent a very long time being known for things that happened in the field, for the citations, for the service record, for the 31 years that had reduced themselves, in official documentation, to a collection of numbers and unit designations that told the story of where I had been without conveying anything useful about what it had cost. I told him that what I had discovered, in the years since I left the field, was that I preferred being known only for whether the floors were clean, that this was a truer identity for me now than anything on my service record, because it was the identity I had chosen rather than the one I had accumulated. I said that this was a true thing about me, not a performance of modesty, and that I hoped he would accept it in the spirit it was offered. He studied me for a long moment. The Vethal, when they study something, are very thorough about it. He said that he found this difficult to understand, and that he also believed me. I said that that was about the best response I could have hoped for. Something moved in his face that might, in a different register in a human face, have been something in the vicinity of a quiet smile. I cannot be certain. The Vethal do not smile the way humans smile. But there was something that shifted the formal register into something that was not formal for just a moment, and then settled back. He said that the residency would be arranged without any attached record, and that the supporting documentation would attribute it to a services agreement renewal. I said that that was more than I had expected, and that I was grateful. He looked at me for one more moment. The corridor was very quiet. The medical wing at 315 is quiet in a particular way, the way places are quiet when everything that needed to happen has happened, and the people involved are in the early part of the long exhale that follows a crisis. I have stood in a great many quiet corridors after a great many crises, and this one was, in its texture, much like the others, the particular quality of after. He said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said it in the Vethal court dialect, and there are things in that dialect that do not translate directly into Terran standard, but the meaning of it was approximately this, that there are things the Empire cannot teach, and that perhaps the Empire had forgotten to look carefully enough at the people it had asked to clean its floors. I did not know what to say to that. I am not usually without a response. I have been in difficult conversations for most of my adult life, and I have generally managed to find something. But that particular thing caught me without one. It was said without any performance. It was said the way someone says a thing they have arrived at while standing in an alcove for 11 hours watching the ceiling of what they had built fail to hold. He turned and went back into the room. I stood in the corridor for a moment with my mop. Then I finished the corridor. It took another 45 minutes to complete the full wing to standard, and I did it the same way I do it every night, working from the east end toward the supply alcove, getting the junctions, not missing the corners, paying attention to the areas near the room entry tracks because those are where the particulate accumulates and where a floor assessment will catch shortcuts if you have been taking them. The monitor in the east sick room stayed in the stable holding register for the entire time. I heard it every time I passed. By the third pass, the child's breathing was audible through the door, which is deeper and slower than before, and has the quality of real sleep rather than the compensating shallow work of a body under siege. I noted this each time and kept moving. At 500, I put the mop and bucket in the supply closet and logged my shift complete on the facility terminal and walked to the service exit. There was a Vethal aide waiting in the service corridor. Not the same aide from earlier. This one was older, with the look of someone from the administrative staff rather than the medical side, wearing the deeper gray uniform of the palace's household service division. She was holding a document tile, the kind the Vethal use for formal records, and she was standing with the posture of someone who has been given a task and intends to complete it correctly. She said my name. I said yes. She said that she had been asked to convey that the residency documentation was already in process, and that I should expect a notification through the standard Terran Authority channel within 3 days, attributed to services renewal, as I had been told. I said thank you. She looked at the document tile for a moment, and then she looked at me and she said, not in an official capacity clearly, because she glanced both ways down the corridor, first in the way that means this is not the part that gets written down. She said that she had a child of her own, a boy, and that she had been in the wing tonight on an administrative matter and had been in the corridor during part of what happened, and that she was glad I had gone through the door. I looked at her for a moment. She was composed, but her hands on the document tile were holding it slightly more firmly than necessary. I told her that I was glad too. I told her that it was going to be fine. I told her the boy was breathing well, and that children are more resilient than we credit them for, that the body at that age has a relationship with recovery that older bodies have to work harder for, and that by tomorrow, he would very likely be asking someone for something to eat and being generally difficult about it in the way that children are when they feel well enough to have opinions about the world again. She nodded and pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she said thank you and walked back the way she had come. I walked to the transit station and took the workers' line back to the residential block where my room is, which is a small room with a good window that looks east and catches the early light when the Vethal sun comes up. The transit at that hour has almost no one on it. A few other night shift workers from the Palace District. All of us in the particular quiet of people who have been working through the hours when most of the world is asleep. Nobody makes conversation on the 500 workers line. We sit with our own company and look at the windows or at nothing and let the movement of the car do what movement does. I made tea when I got back to my room. I sat in the chair by the window and held the cup and watched the light change. The Vethal sun comes up in a slow gradient, not the quick hard arrival of some systems I have lived under. It builds from a kind of dark amber to the golden pale that is the color of this world at morning, and there is a period in the middle where the sky is a color I cannot name exactly, a color that is not quite the same as anything I saw in 31 years of moving through the galaxy, but that is beautiful in a quiet way that requires no history to appreciate. I have sat in this chair and watched this window on the mornings after my night shifts for most of the 2 years I have been here, and I have not tired of it. I am not given to sentimentality, and I am not going to pretend that what happened in that corridor was more than what it was. I saw something. I knew what I was seeing because I had seen it before, many times, in harder places and with less equipment, and with the additional difficulty of being in a field situation where the patient is not lying in a medical bed but on the ground or in the back of a transport or in some improvised space that was never meant to hold a sick person. I acted on what I knew. The child breathed. That is the transaction, and it is a complete one. It does not need to be made into anything larger than it is. What I will say, because it is true and because I am 61 and I have earned the right to say the true things when they occur to me, is that there was a moment in that corridor when the Emperor looked at me, after the monitor had settled, after his face had done the thing that private relief does to a face, and something passed between us that I do not have a proper word for. It was not gratitude, although that was part of it. It was not recognition in the formal sense he had offered, which I declined. It was something more precise than either of those. It was the moment when a person who has authority and power and position looks at a person who has none of those things and sees, for the first time, or perhaps for the first time clearly, that the categories they use to organize the world are not actually descriptions of what people are. That the woman mopping the floor at 300 might be carrying something invisible. That invisible does not mean absent. That the tool in a person's hands on any given day is not the measure of what they know. I have been moving through the world for a long time with what I know, and most of the time the world has not been very interested in it. That is not a complaint. The world is a large place, and most of what moves through it goes unmarked, which is simply the condition of being alive in a large place. I have known this since I was 22 years old and have made my peace with it, or as much peace as one makes with things of that kind. But I have waited a long time to be seen in that particular way. Not the citation, not the record, the seeing. The moment in the corridor when a man who could have thanked me efficiently and gone back into the room instead stood in a corridor at 3:15 and said what he already knew the answer to, said it out loud, said it into the air of the corridor so that it would exist, who cleared my son's airway, as if the who mattered. As if who was the word that the moment required and he knew it. That was not nothing. I sat in my chair with my tea and let it settle into me the way things settle when they have been a long time coming, carefully, like a person sitting down after a very long stand. I watched the Vethal sun finish its slow arrival. Then I went asleep, which I do well for a woman my age who spent 31 years in places where sleeping well was not always an option, and I slept until early afternoon. And when I got up I ate something and reviewed my shift schedule and found that I was down for the medical wing again the following night. East Corridor, Supply Alcove, the long junction past the sick rooms, the floor near the East Room's track, where the particulate builds up if you let it. I noted this. I made a second cup of tea. I thought about the boy, who was 5 or 6 and had put a small, interesting piece of the world in his mouth because that is what small, interesting people do with the world, and who would wake up tomorrow and never know how close it was. This seemed to me, on reflection, like the correct outcome. The not knowing, the sealed gap. He would have decades of knowing things ahead of him. He did not need to start with this one. I have floors to clean,